Hi, my name is Dustin Messer. I am a priest here at All Saints Dallas. Once a week or so, we talk with an outside guest to help us think more clearly about God, His Word, and His world. Today, we are joined by Christopher Watkin, who teaches at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Christopher is the author of many books that have been very helpful to me personally. His newest book is called Biblical Critical Theory: How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. Christopher, thank you for joining us.
Lovely to be here, Dustin. Thank you for having me on.
Christopher, I wonder, before I ask you some questions related to your book, if you'd just tell us a little bit about you, how you came to faith in the Lord and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. So I'm a Yorkshireman, born and bred, spent the first 2 decades of my life in Yorkshire. And I was really a happy atheist, I suppose you'd say, until I was about 15. So I didn't feel any God-shaped holes or any need for anything more, no sort of yearning for transcendence. So just really happy as an atheist. And it was really a school visit to the battlefields of the First World War that started to get me thinking about death to begin with, not really about God. And, you see these huge fields just filled with gravestones. And, you think, wow, that's something incredibly important has happened. But in what sense can we say that it's important? What does it matter? Where are these people now? Did it mean anything? And I was invited along to church by a good friend at the time. And by God's grace, it happened to be a Bible teaching, Bible believing church where people were born again and loved each other and tried to live the Bible out. And I guess over a period of 2 years or so, I got to the position where I wasn't a Christian yet, but I couldn't walk away. There was something about the way the people loved each other in the church that was different and new and intoxicating and inexplicable. And there was something about the Jesus of the Bible that was similar. So I didn't think he was who he said he was yet, but I didn't have a category for him. He didn't fit anything that I could make sense of. And I don't know the moment when I became a Christian. I think I prayed a couple of prayers of commitment over the years. Nothing spectacular happened with any of them. But the first time that I realized that, yes, I certainly am a Christian was the first youth camp I went on. They're called cipher camps in the UK with my church. And I just found that the Bible teaching electrifying, so thrilling. I enjoyed serving other people, which if you were me, is not something that I would have expected to enjoy. And that's the point where I thought, yes, this is absolutely true. This is the way the world is. And I am thrilled to have realized that. And then ever since then, it's been, 2 steps forward by God's grace, 1 step back because of my sin. Going up to university was a key time to see how people my age who really believed what they believe lived. And yeah, God hasn't given up on me yet. So there's hope.
There's hope for us all. I really appreciate you sharing that story. You mentioned the way the world is. In some ways, that's the subject of not only this most recent book, but a lot of your work, which is dealt in the realm of philosophy. You've been trying to figure out what the world is. How is it? How has God set the world up? You use the phrase here, biblical critical theory. I think many of us will intuit biblical. What is critical theory?
Think of it in terms of concentric circles. So the widest sense of the term critical theory is any approach to society that tries to take a critical stance to the status quo, that says that the way things are is not the way that they should be. And almost everybody, I think, would say that nowadays. Nobody thinks this is paradise on earth. Nobody thinks we should change nothing in society. So just critical in that general sense. Then the first sense of critical theory that I came across in my undergraduate degree, I did a unit called Modern Critical Theory. It was the best unit I did as an undergrad, really fascinating sort of insight into how people see the world, was dealing with modern post-Enlightenment philosophies. So there was a week on Derrida, there was a week on Foucault, there was a week on Deleuze in that unit. And that was critical in the sense of in the Kantian sense, which is seeking to know the limits of our knowledge, rather than assuming that we can know everything, to know the limits of what we can know. And that was the sense of critical theory that I had for many years. But recently, I guess all the oxygen has been sucked up by a new, very narrow sense of critical theory, which riffs off something called the Frankfurt School, a group of mainly German-speaking philosophers in the early 20th century who tried to take broadly Marxist ideas, although they were critical of some aspects of Marxism, and to read culture through a Marxist lens. And then even more narrowly today, you've got what's called critical race theory, which takes some of those ideas and some ideas from elsewhere and tries to understand how race functions in society through that particular lens. And so while you'd be forgiven if you watch the news today for thinking that the only sense of critical theory has ever been this sort of quite narrow Frankfurt School sense. There's actually a long history of critical theory in a broader sense, which during the 90s was the sense that I was familiar with. It's a critical approach to society that says this is not how it is, but there's a vision for how it could be better.
Yeah. And what would you say to someone who said, maybe as you say, the only exposure they have to the phrase critical theory is through kind of hot button political issues. And they may say, you talk about biblical critical theory, other people talk about feminism or race or all these different critical theories. Why can't I just go through life encountering reality as I see it? Why can't I just kind of go through life neutrally without any worldview, critical theory, philosophy? Do I really need something through which to interpret reality?
I think so. First of all, that's a very reasonable position to have. I think people are suspicious of these big overarching theories, and there's history in the 20th century of why you're going to want to be suspicious of people saying this is the key to life. Look at life through this lens. But I think the danger and the pathos of that position is that you can't avoid having an approach to life. The psychologists say, don't they, that we receive through our senses about 50 million bits of information a second, and we can process about 50 of those. So we have to have a filter. We have to decide what's important because you can't pay attention to everything. And so the choice that we've got is you either do that consciously and you try to think about, well, what sort of filter do I want to have? Or you let someone else do it for you. You let the society around you decide in your place what filter you should have. And I just think the first one of those is much more satisfying and much more responsible. You wouldn't just hand over your bank card to someone else and say, spend it however you like, or you wouldn't hand the keys of your house over to someone else and say, do whatever you want with it. Well, similarly, you don't want to hand your mental furniture over to anyone else and say, well, just whatever's going in society, that's going to be my view because I'm not going to take ownership of it. I'm not going to think about it at all or critique it. Just seems a bit dangerous.
And I want to ask questions about the biblical part of biblical critical theory, but maybe one more kind of preliminary question might be, you say if we don't take ownership, let's just say we don't. We live in kind of a modern Western world. We're here in downtown Dallas. If we don't take ownership, what sort of philosophy, critical theory are we kind of unconsciously adopting? You talk about John Locke in the book. You talk about Rousseau. Kind of make explicit some things that if we aren't really critical of our critical theory we go through life with, that we'll kind of unconsciously adopt.
Yeah, that's a really helpful question. Thank you, Dustin. Let me just say one little word of intro before I get straight to your question. It's not that we can sort of take ownership in a sense that we can sort of shrug off everything that society is telling us and sort of become pristine and utterly sort of not influenced by anything outside us. I think that it itself is quite naive because you end up not realizing how you're being influenced. So taking ownership is sort of an incremental thing. It's a lifelong task. It's not that you can click your fingers and leave culture outside the door suddenly. In terms of what happens if you don't think about things today, it's really complex is the first thing to say. There's no one sentence answer to that. So Charles Taylor in A Secular Age says that what's happened today is not that we've got one single sort of dominant philosophy, but it's fractured. There's been what he calls this nova. There's lots of people believing lots of different sort of things in society. So I think the first thing that you would probably be is a little confused and pulled in different directions. One example perhaps would be that views of what human beings are in society are really polarized today. So there's one current of thought that insists that there's no real difference between human beings and any other animal in terms of moral value or worth, or that, as Thomas Hobbes said in the opening of his Leviathan, which is one of the key foundational texts of the modern world, we're basically just cogs and springs and wheels, and there's nothing more fancy to us than that. So on one side, you've got that quite reductive view of human beings. But then there's another view of human beings circulating in society, which is really that we're each gods of our own universes, that we can define reality as we want it to be, and we can decide for ourselves what the good life is and live that out, and no one should be able to stop us. And trying to juggle those two is really awkward and really destructive. And I think from Christians, it should evoke a response of real compassion and pathos for people who are trying to say, well, on the one hand, I'm being told that I'm a machine, and on the other hand, I'm being told that I'm a god and I can make the world in my own image. And how do you live out the tension of that reality? I think it's really agonizing, really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So this gets us to, I think, biblical critical theory. I've taught philosophy over the years. You teach philosophy now. Oftentimes, as you know, say in a survey course, you only get a very limited amount of time to deal with whether it's Locke, Rousseau, Marx, anybody, and you're kind of giving a summation, an elevator pitch for what a various philosopher or ism teaches. What would be kind of the elevator pitch if you came to biblical critical theory and it was added in a textbook, and you just had, say a minute with in front of a class to describe biblical critical theory? What is it?
It's a way of understanding human beings and the world that reads it through the biblical storyline of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation, which opens up incredible vistas of possibility for cultural critique that we can go into after this 1 minute answer, if you like. And that's it. That's what it does. Creation, fall, redemption, consummation. The best example of it in history, I think, is Augustine's City of God. That's what he's doing.
Yeah. So maybe a good next question would be a phrase you use in the book called diagonalization, or I guess just a word you use in the book. So maybe just say something about what diagonalization is, but just kind of as background into it. We've mentioned different philosophies, philosophers. There's a danger, it seems to me, of just putting an ism on something as a Christian and then dismissing it out of hand, and to say, okay, this is atheism. I'm not going to listen to anything it says because I know the ism. Another danger may just be sort of swallowing unconsciously or thoughtlessly everything that is said to us, and maybe using kind of a common grace argument to say, well, everything has some truth in it or something. How does biblical critical theory help us engage with the different isms we bump up against? And then maybe something specifically about diagonalization, because I thought that was such a helpful frame for Christians to have.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there are two separate questions in there. There's how do we deal with the isms, and then the diagonalization. So I'll do the isms first. I think the most helpful model for this over the years for me, and just an incredibly rich model, is in 1 Corinthians 1, what Paul does with Greek wisdom and the Jewish demand for signs, because he shows us a way through a roadblock that we keep hitting in our cultural critique time and again. So he comes across these major cultural values in the society around him. Greeks look for wisdom, Jews demand miraculous signs, which later in the passage we see what they want is the power, the manifestation of power in these signs. And the first thing that Paul does is he draws an absolute uncompromising antithesis between those things and the cross. He says the cross is foolishness to the Greeks. It's the opposite of what they're looking for. And it's weakness to the Jews. And so he's all in on antithesis. But then what he does, and this is the brilliance of the passage, is he then goes all in on fulfillment as well. And he ends up at the end of the passage saying the foolishness of God is wiser. So they can be compared with each other. And actually, if you want wisdom, you need to go for the foolishness of God, because that's peak wisdom, you Jews, he says. And if you want to go for strength and power, you Greeks, if you want to go for strength and power, you Jews, you need to come to the cross, because that is peak power. And so he's hitting these two notes without either of them compromising the other. There's an absolute antithesis between what you're looking for, Greeks, and what the cross offers. And the cross, you Greeks, is also the absolute fulfillment of everything that you want. And if you're serious about searching for it, you need to come to the cross, because that's the only place you're going to find it. Now, the reason that that's so brilliant is that our cultural critique tends to gravitate to one of those poles or the other. And then we get these sort of bun fights between the people who are all about antithesis, saying, oh, yes, here we go, Christians saying that the Bible is the fulfillment of cultural narratives again, how predictable. And the fulfillment people saying, all these culture haters on the antithesis side who don't take what the Bible says seriously about all things being brought under Christ. And the tragedy of that discussion is that both of those are sub-biblical. Because what Paul is doing is he's saying yes to antithesis, and he's saying yes to fulfillment. And I think we need to follow that biblical pattern. And, as George Whitefield once said, put away our swords. There is no battle between these two things. Do you want to come back on anything before I do diagonalization?
Well, maybe just, this will get into diagonalization. Today in America, I realize today is tomorrow for you in Australia, but today is election day here in America. You talk about two extremes in the book, and then kind of apply diagonalization. An extreme of sort of a pessimism that leads to cynicism about our ability to create a politics that works well. We could just kind of write off our political duties and become cynical, or a utopian idealism that says, we need to achieve heaven on earth here and now, and that's something that we should expect. And what you don't do is just say, well, look, everything is just, the gospel kind of always answers everything just right down the middle. And still, you, as you just alluded to, do this sort of subversive fulfillment move. How would you use diagonalization to help us Americans who are in the middle? Is the day, I guess it's kind of end of the day now, but of election day, how would diagonalization help us think about what we can expect as we engage in politics?
I preface what I say by, stating the obvious. I've never lived in the US. I'm not intimately familiar with US politics, and I wouldn't presume to lecture Americans about how they should do their politics. So that needs to be said before I say anything else. There are lots of people who know lots more about American politics than I do. That what diagonalization does is it takes two polarized positions. So it may be political positions, or it may, for example, be the idea that we're either animals or we're gods that we were talking about a moment ago. And as you say, what it doesn't do is just split the difference between them. It shows how they're both reductive heresies of a more complex, harmonious biblical truth. So if we take, we're animals, no, we're gods, those two have dismembered and pulled apart bits of the doctrine of the image of God and set them in opposition to each other. So the image of God says you have huge dignity and worth, and it also says you're not God because you're the image of God. So there's a humbling in the image of God doctrine, and there's an exaltation. Now, what our society's done is it's ripped those apart so that they're no longer in harmony, and it's opposed them to each other. So now you've got to sort of choose. Do you want the humbling side or do you want the exaltation side? And if you want one, you're an animal, and if you want the other, you're a God. And so diagonalizing that opposition is to say, well, the Bible has got a way of thinking about this issue of what a human being is that predates this dichotomy. So it's not that the dichotomy comes first and then the Bible finds a middle way. It's that the biblical doctrine of the image of God is the first way, and then it gets messed about in modern society. And what we're doing is pointing people back to the original harmony. And so if you want to do that with politics, there are various ways that you could try and work that through in a political frame. There's the sense in which, and a book that I read a little while ago was really helpful on this. A guy called George Lakoff, he's on the left himself, but he tries to analyze what it is that accounts for the divide in politics. And he says, fundamentally, below the policy level, when you get down to the sort of gut instinct level of what the political divide is about, he says that it's about different views of authority and, he says, parenthood. So on the one side, you've got what he calls the strict father morality. You know, everybody should earn their own way. It's all about merit. People should be punished when they do things wrong. And on the other side, he says you've got the nurturing parents model, where it's all about compassion. We need to give people, you know, the grace and the space to grow and so forth. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only way of doing it. There are lots of ways of thinking about the divide. This is just one of them that I found helpful. And he also, in the book where he talks about this, has a really interesting passage about God. So he's not a Christian, as far as I know, and he doesn't write as a Christian. But he's saying that both of these aspects of parenthood are there in God. So, you know, God gives rules and he enforces them, 10 Commandments and so forth. But he's also gracious and nurturing and very forgiving with his people. And I think that gives you a pattern for working out how you might diagonalize modern politics. So both of the sides of politics have caught on to something about the character of God. He's gracious and compassionate and forgiving and nurturing, yes. And he you know, sets rules, and he's holy, and he, you know, he will judge. Yes, both of those things are true. Now, in the Bible, they're not in tension with each other. It's not that the less compassionate God is, the more he judges. That they're in beautiful harmony. But modern politics has wrenched them apart and made us choose agonizingly between these two sides of, or aspects of God's character. And of course you can't. You know, if you have one to the exclusion of the other, you end up with a caricature of God on both sides. And so the way that you might want to speak into that situation from a biblical point of view is to say, well, why don't you go back to the God in whom both of these sort of reductive shards of his character are in beautiful harmony, and you know, rather than forcing a choice between these two reductive versions, these two partial versions of what God is.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So that's a good way, I think, just talking that through was really helpful, I think, for us just thinking about politics generally. I want to be sensitive to your time, so maybe just one or two more kind of examples of not just diagonalization, but using biblical critical theory. I think you've said something about man, something about politics. This is related to both. I wonder if you'd say something about identity. That is something of a buzzword now, or something we're very kind of hyper conscious of our identity. How does the biblical story make sense of man's identity?
What a great question. I think you'd start, as with all these big questions, in terms of the creation, fall, redemption framework. And what that does is it makes human identity part of a story. And for reasons that I go into in the book in some length, that is incredibly important and incredibly different to the ways in which identity is often passed out in both ancient and modern cultures. And what it gives you is a sense of that the fundamental, the first chapter in the book, if you like, is a good creation. So when God created human beings to begin with, and I think Sam Albury said this beautifully when you were talking with him a little while ago as well, he didn't say, let me make sinners in order that I might bash them over the head and say how rotten they are. God made people in his image. So the first word is of a good creation. I was, you were originally the plan for human creation was to be good. And I think that's such an important word to hear for the reasons that Sam was saying in your conversation, that a lot of people today, and perhaps all of us to some extent, struggle with a negative view of ourselves, either that we're worthless or we're not living up to some sort of standard that we set for ourselves. And so that original affirmation of creation is incredibly important. But of course, none of us are living in Genesis 1 now. We're all suffering because of our own sin, but also from the sins of others, from the fall. And so none of us has a sort of a fully perfected identity in this present age. None of us, not one of us, however long we've been Christians, that there are parts of our identity that are in conflict with each other, that are messed up. Paul talks about this. I'm not what I want to be. Romans 7 and so forth. And if that's where you left it, that would be a message of despair, wouldn't it? But there's for the Christian view, how I am now is not how God will leave me, and how I will be for eternity is much transformed to how I am now. So whatever I'm struggling with in terms of my identity, however messed up and worthless I perceive myself to be at the moment, God speaks a word of hope into that. And this is 1 Corinthians 15. It's the resurrection hope of being made new in Christ, which also feeds back into how I see myself in the present. So it's not just sort of pie in the sky when you die stuff. It's the solid expectation that I will be transformed radically. And, as C.S. Lewis says, made into the sort of being that if I met him or her now, I would either want to recoil from in horror or worship. There will be a radical transformation of me. And that means that I view myself now in terms of what Augustine in the Confessions sees as a whole sort of mixed bag of sort of desires and ideas and dispositions in tension with each other, but I look to the future and see those gathered together in Christ. And it's when I look outside myself, for Augustine and for the Bible writers as well, that I find myself. It's in a sense when I forget myself, and I know there's been a back and forth about the idea of self-forgetfulness and how useful that is, but in a sort of thumbnail way, when I look away from myself into Christ, that's when I find myself. And Augustine does this beautifully in the Confessions. It's why the Confessions is written in the form of a prayer, that in order to understand himself, he needs to speak in the second person and open himself to God.
Yeah, really helpful. So I think that was an example of starting with kind of a question. Of course, isn't modern in a sense. I mean, the Bible has a lot to say about identity, but starting with a question and then kind of going backward and using this biblical critical theory to approach it. Maybe we can do the opposite, which is take one of those component parts of biblical critical theory, eschatology, new creation, and then work forward, develop out of it. In Dallas, Texas, there was a seminary here that really, I would say, focused on eschatology. A lot of the folks who I talk with here in Dallas, because of that, maybe their childhood, they hear the word eschatology and they just picture a lot of maps and graphs on the wall and maybe some not fun Sunday school experiences they had, and they are not overly eager to talk about eschatology. Why is thinking about eschatology helpful? And if we took a biblical eschatology seriously, how would it affect how we engage with culture, politics, the world here and now?
It's important because unless you know where you're going, you don't know how to get there, do you? If you're on a journey, you're not quite sure where you're going to end up or what you're going to need when you get there. Then it's very hard to make sense of the journey. It's like reading a wonderful novel with the final chapter ripped out. You're sort of always wondering, well, what would have happened at the end? Because everything, sort of the way that it's tied up, often sort of reflects back on your sense of the whole novel, doesn't it? There's often a twist at the end that reframes the whole of the rest of it. So if you don't know how things are going to finish, it's really, really hard to live in the present. And I think the New Testament is just really hot on this time and time and time again. Obviously it's really present in Thessalonians, but elsewhere in other of the Gospels and in Paul's letters, and of course in the book of Revelation. It's you learn how to live wisely in the present by knowing what will happen in the future. And I don't mean the tiny details of the order of things in Revelation. I mean the idea that everything will be gathered under Christ. There will be a judgment, and there will be an eternity. And the way that dignifies the present, the way that it helps you, and Miroslav Volf is really good on this in Exclusion and Embrace, the way that it helps you to fight for justice in the present without forcing an absolute justice now at the point of a gun, without becoming terroristic about enforcing justice now, is really important, I think. Because if you haven't got that sense that God will judge, and yet he commands me to be seeking justice in the present, you'll either just check out and say there's never going to be justice, it's all a big mess and there's no meaning to existence, and so I'm just going to let it all happen. Or you'll do what the characters in Albert Camus' play The Just Assassins do, and he's really aware of this. He says, look, through his characters, Camus is saying, if we don't bring justice now, there is no justice. And so, and they are a group of terrorists. And so they say, we've got to kill the leader of this particular nation, otherwise forget justice. And so those are the two options you've left with if you don't have a robust eschatology. And both, the sort of, I don't care, it's all meaningless anyway, and we've got to bring justice now, whatever it costs, I think are both really inadequate and dangerous positions. And so it's a good, strong biblical eschatology that can give us a better way than that.
You use, I believe, quoting someone else, but use the expression anti-tragedy to explain the Christian view of reality. I thought that's such a beautiful way that we are living in a comedy in that sense, that all things are headed towards this hopeful end. If you've been watching this and you would like to talk more, I'd be happy to talk with you. My email is dustin@ascdallas.org. If you'd like to read the book with me in a group, I also would be happy to do that. Again, it's called Biblical Critical Theory. Christopher Watkin has been talking with us. Christopher, thank you again for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Dustin. It's been a real joy for me. Thank you for having me on.
Go in peace.